In 1901, Theodore Roosevelt became the President of the United States. Because he was brave, eager, and full of energy, he had already made a name for himself in sports and politics. He was in charge of a group of men called the Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War. He was a good boss because of this. Roosevelt got the backing of the American people quickly because he was easy to like. Roosevelt worked to get his plans and projects done by using his fame to his advantage. He wanted everyone to get a fair deal, which he called a square deal. This word was used to talk about some changes that his government tried to make. Roosevelt thought that the United States of today needed a strong federal government in order to solve its problems. He used the power of the government to face these problems straight on. Roosevelt had to deal with a big problem called trusts. Trusts were very powerful businesses in their own markets. At first, they lowered their prices to drive out smaller competitors. When there was no one else to compete with, the trusts kept raising prices. About 80% of U.S. businesses were run by trusts by the year 1900. Roosevelt liked big businesses, but he also knew that some trusts were bad for the country. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 let him sue 44 trusts to stop them from doing bad things. Because of what he did, he was called a trust buster. In 1902, there was a strike of about 140,000 coal workers in Pennsylvania. The mine's owners wouldn't talk to the people who worked there. President Roosevelt got involved and asked both sides to meet at the White House to talk things over. He even said that the government would take over the mines if a deal couldn't be reached. In the end, a committee was set up to help settle the debate, which led to a middle ground. This event was a turning point because it led to a bigger role for the federal government in labor problems. The Interstate Commerce Commission, ICC, which was set up in 1887, was in charge of running the train business, but it wasn't strong enough to do anything. Roosevelt made it easy for the government to keep track of railroads by passing new rules. In 1903, the Elkin Act made it illegal for train officials to give refunds to shippers as a way to bribe them. Also, the Hepburn Act of 1906 made it hard to get free train passes, which helped stop cheating even more. These efforts led to more fair shipping costs and made it easier for the federal government to run the train business. Overall, Theodore Roosevelt's presidency was marked by his desire to solve problems and protect people's rights. He tried to make society more fair and well-run by introducing progressive changes, trying to break up business groups called trusts, getting involved in labor disputes, and regulating the railroad industry. During Theodore Roosevelt's time in office as president, many important changes were made to help solve problems in the United States. After reading The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which showed that the meatpacking business was not clean, Roosevelt took action. He put together a group to look into the business, and their report confirmed what the book said. So Roosevelt pushed for the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, which set strict rules for cleanliness and set up federal processes for inspecting meat. The Pure Food and Drug Act was passed by Congress in the same year. This law said that contaminated foods and drugs couldn't be sold, and it also said that labels had to be correct. The Bureau of Chemistry, which later became the Food and Drug Administration, was given the job of making sure this act was followed and that food and drugs were safe to eat. Before Roosevelt's time in office, the federal government didn't pay much attention to preserving environmental resources, but Roosevelt knew how important it was to protect the country's forests. Inspired by naturalist John Muir, he set aside huge amounts of land as forest reserves, national parks, monuments, and wildlife sanctuaries. A conservationist named Gifford Pinchot was put in charge of the U.S. Forest Service to lead these efforts. Roosevelt's policies on conservation tried to find a good mix between preserving wilderness and using land for the good of everyone. Some people wanted to keep all natural resources untouched, but Roosevelt thought it was important to use them in a responsible way. The National Reclamation Act, which is also called the Newlands Act, paid for irrigation projects that turned dry lands into good places to grow crops. Among other things, this act was used to build the Roosevelt Dam in Arizona. This set a precedent for how the federal government would handle water resources in the West. Theodore Roosevelt cared more about the environment than about human rights when he was president. Like many other progressives, he didn't work for civil rights for all African Americans, but he did help a few people. Roosevelt fought against the white Southerners in order to protect the political rights of some African Americans. For example, he put an African American in charge of the Customs Office in Charleston, South Carolina. even though white people there didn't like the idea. He even shut down a post office because white people wouldn't work with the black postmistress he had chosen. Roosevelt also invited Booker T. Washington, an African American leader who was respected by powerful whites, to have dinner with him. This was a way for Roosevelt to show his support for Washington's work. Booker T. Washington, on the other hand, thought that African Americans should accept the fact that white people still treated them unfairly. Other African American leaders did not agree with this point of view. In 1909, black leaders such as Webb Du Bois started a group called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, to fight for civil rights and racial equality. Even with all of these attempts, the main focus of the progressive movement was on the needs of middle-class white Americans. The two leaders who came after Roosevelt didn't do much to make racial equality a main goal either.